You scroll through your feed and something catches your eye. A productivity guru explaining how to maximize your morning routine. A financial advisor breaking down passive income streams. A wellness influencer demonstrating the optimal breathing technique for anxiety management. You save them all. You'll watch them later when you have time to implement their systems. But later never comes. Instead, you accumulate hundreds of save posts, dozens of bookmarked articles, a queue of optimization waiting to be consumed. And beneath this accumulation, a quiet desperation grows. The sense that everyone else has figured out the algorithm while you're still struggling with the basics. Here's what they don't tell you. That desperation isn't a personal deficit. It's the algorithm working exactly as designed. The platforms have discovered something more profitable than selling you products. They've learned to sell you a project, the project of yourself. Every scroll reinforces the same message. You are improvable. You are incomplete. You are, in your current form, insufficient. The genius of this system is that it never presents itself as coercion. Nobody forces you to optimize. Nobody demands you perform. Instead, the algorithm simply shows you what's possible. It presents an endless gallery of people who've already achieved what you're attempting. People who wake at 5. People who've monetized their hobbies. People who've transformed their bodies, their careers, their entire lives through the application of the right system. And in this gallery, your unoptimized self becomes intolerable. The algorithm doesn't just recommend content. It constructs a reality. It builds a world where success appears effortless, where transformation is always 3 steps away, where the gap between who you are and who you could be is simultaneously vast and bridgeable. This is the paradox at the heart of achievement capitalism. The system requires you to believe 2 contradictory things simultaneously. First, that you are deeply flawed, that your current existence is a rough draft awaiting revision. Second, that transformation is always accessible, that the right morning routine or productivity hack or mindset shift will finally unlock your potential. You internalize this contradiction. You wake up tired and immediately diagnose yourself as lazy. You struggle to focus and label yourself as undisciplined. You feel overwhelmed and conclude you're bad at time management. The algorithm has taught you to translate structural problems into personal failures. But here's what the system cannot afford for you to recognize. Your exhaustion isn't a character flaw. Your difficulty focusing isn't a deficit of willpower. Your overwhelm isn't evidence of poor planning. These are accurate responses to an environment engineered to extract maximum performance while providing minimum stability. The person who works 2 jobs to afford basic housing isn't suffering from poor time management. The person who cannot concentrate in an office designed for constant interruption isn't battling a focus problem. The person who feels paralyzed by an endless task list isn't experiencing procrastination. They're experiencing the predictable results of a system that demands infinite capacity from finite beings. The algorithm profits from your misdiagnosis. Every moment you spend examining your personal failures is a moment you're not examining structural impossibilities. Every product you purchase to fix yourself is revenue extracted from your mislabeled exhaustion. They've made self-surveillance irresistible. The algorithm doesn't force you to track your steps, monitor your sleep, quantify your productivity. It simply makes these metrics visible, then allows comparison to do its work. You see someone's reading list. 52 books in a year. You've read 7. The comparison is automatic. The judgment immediate. You're not reading enough. You're not learning enough. You're not growing enough. But nobody shows you the metric that matters. Nobody posts about the hours spent staring at pages without comprehension because exhaustion has made reading feel like labor. Nobody shares their screen time data, showing 8 hours of mindless scrolling as a coping mechanism for unbearable pressure. Nobody admits that their curated life exists primarily as performance, that behind the optimized facade lies the same confusion and depletion you're experiencing. The algorithm creates what appears to be transparency while actually constructing opacity. You see the results, but never the process. You see the achievement, but never the cost. You see the transformation, but never the context that made it possible. A person who inherits wealth and quits their job to pursue passion projects presents this as the result of courage and clarity. They don't mention the safety net. They don't discuss the privilege of risk. They frame their choice as reproducible, as evidence that anyone could do the same if only they wanted it badly enough. The algorithm amplifies this narrative because it's profitable. It converts structural advantages into personal virtues, then sells you the tools to develop those virtues yourself. It takes the outcomes of privilege and repackages them as the rewards of optimization. And you, watching from a position of actual constraint, misread your situation. You conclude that you lack courage rather than resources. You diagnose yourself as fearful rather than rationally calculating the risks you actually face. You internalize their freedom as evidence of your limitation. The algorithm has taught you a new way to suffer, not through prohibition, but through possibility. It doesn't tell you that you cannot achieve. It shows you endless evidence that others already have. This is more effective than any external constraint. When success is prohibited, you can blame the barrier. When success is possible but elusive, you can only blame yourself. You scroll through testimonials. People who learned to code in 3 months. People who built 6-figure businesses from their bedrooms. People who achieved financial independence before 30. The algorithm ensures you see these stories daily, sometimes hourly. Each story carries an implicit accusation. If they could do it, why haven't you? If the path exists, why aren't you walking it? If transformation is possible, why are you still stuck? The answer the system wants you to reach is always personal. You're not disciplined enough. You're not committed enough. You're not hungry enough. You haven't found the right system. You haven't implemented the correct framework. You haven't optimized sufficiently. But there's another answer, one that threatens the entire architecture. What if your stuckness isn't a personal problem? What if it's an accurate reflection of actual limits? What if the algorithm is showing you exceptions while training you to perceive them as norms? The person who builds a $1 million business from their laptop isn't demonstrating what's universally possible. They're demonstrating what's occasionally possible under specific conditions that are never fully disclosed. The timing, the connections, the prior experience, the financial cushion that allowed them to work unpaid for months. The algorithm strips away context and presents outcome as methodology. And you, consuming these decontextualized successes, reconstruct them as personal failures. You conclude that you lack what they possessed. You search for the missing ingredient in yourself rather than questioning the narrative's completeness. The algorithm has discovered how to monetize even your resistance. You recognize the hollowness of curated perfection, so you search for authenticity. And the system, always adaptive, provides it. Vulnerability becomes content. Struggle becomes brand. The entrepreneur posts about their mental health journey. The influencer shares their anxiety. The productivity guru admits to burnout. And you, watching this performed authenticity, feel momentarily relieved. Finally, someone being real. But notice what happens next. The vulnerability is always followed by transcendence. The anxiety is overcome through the right therapeutic framework. The burnout is solved by better boundaries and a revised morning routine. The struggle is never structural. It's always personal, and therefore always solvable. This is the algorithm's most sophisticated operation. It allows you to see the cracks in the performance, but only as prelude to a better performance. It permits acknowledgement of difficulty, but only as origin story for eventual triumph. It creates the illusion of transparency while maintaining the fundamental lie that your exhaustion is fixable through individual action. The person who shares their burnout story while selling you their recovery program isn't subverting the system. They're deepening it. They're taking the moment of recognition, that instant where you might have glimpsed the impossibility of what's being demanded, and converting it back into market opportunity. You're taught to read every confession of struggle as evidence that struggle can be overcome. Every admission of difficulty becomes proof that difficulty is temporary. Every moment of apparent honesty is actually a sales pitch for the next optimization tool. The algorithm profits from both your aspiration and your failure. It sells you the dream, then sells you the solution to your inability to achieve the dream, then sells you the narrative framework for understanding why you needed to fail before you could succeed. And throughout this cycle, the fundamental question is never asked. What if the dream itself is the problem? What if the aspiration the algorithm cultivates is structurally unachievable? What if your failure isn't a stepping stone, but an accurate diagnosis? They've even invaded your sleep. The algorithm doesn't just optimize your waking hours. It's come for the 8 hours you use to spend unconscious. Sleep tracking, sleep optimization, sleep hygiene, sleep cycles. The metrics multiply. You discover you're not resting correctly. You're not dreaming efficiently. You're not recovering optimally. The absurdity would be funny if it weren't so totalizing. They've taken the one activity that existed outside productivity and converted it into another performance metric. Your unconscious mind is now subject to conscious management. But beneath the absurdity lies a deeper logic. Rest, actual rest, is dangerous to the system. Because rest is time beyond extraction. It's hours where you're not producing, not consuming, not generating data. Rest represents a limit, and the algorithm cannot tolerate limits. So rest is reconceptualized as optimization. You don't sleep because your body needs unconsciousness. You sleep because high-quality rest improves cognitive performance, emotional regulation, and metabolic efficiency. Sleep becomes another tool in your productivity arsenal. And if you sleep poorly, that's a personal problem. You need better curtains, a different mattress, a sleep supplement, a meditation practice, a revised bedtime routine. The solution is always individual. The problem is never that the system has destroyed the conditions that make rest possible. You lie awake at 3 in the morning, anxiety cycling through your mind. The algorithm has taught you to diagnose this as a sleep disorder. But what if it's accurate perception? What if your nervous system is correctly detecting that tomorrow will require more than you have to give? What if your insomnia is lucidity? The person who cannot sleep under impossible conditions isn't broken. They're responsive. Their body is refusing a demand that cannot be met. But the algorithm cannot afford this reading. It must convert your accurate distress into personal pathology because structural diagnosis threatens the entire system. The algorithm shows you results, but never the work. You see the published novel, but not the years of rejection. You see the successful business, but not the unpaid labor that preceded profitability. You see the transformed body, but not the unsustainable restriction that achieved it. This invisibility serves a purpose. It makes success appear accessible while obscuring the actual cost. It allows the system to present achievement as the natural result of proper technique rather than extraordinary effort combined with favorable conditions. The writer who publishes their first novel at 25 doesn't mention the financial support that allowed them to write unpaid for 3 years. The entrepreneur who scales their startup doesn't discuss the connections that open doors. The person who maintains their aesthetic doesn't reveal the disordered relationship with food that sustains it. And you, watching these curated outcomes, mistake privilege for process. You conclude that you lack dedication rather than recognizing that you lack the conditions that make dedication sustainable. You internalize their ease as evidence of your difficulty. The algorithm has made invisible labor its greatest trick. It shows you the harvest, but never the planting. It presents the summit, but erases the climb. And in this erasure, it creates the cruelest illusion that achievement should feel effortless. So when your own efforts feel laborious, when your progress feels slow, when your work feels like work, you diagnose yourself as doing it wrong. You search for the hack, the shortcut, the system that will make it easy. Because the algorithm has taught you that struggle is evidence of incorrect methodology. But what if struggle is simply struggle? What if difficulty is the accurate experience of doing difficult things? What if the person who makes it look easy is either lying about the effort or operating under conditions so advantageous they've forgotten effort exists? The algorithm promises liberation, through optimization. Work from anywhere. Be your own boss. Design your ideal life. The language of freedom saturates every scroll. But notice what this freedom requires. Constant availability, perpetual productivity, self-surveillance more rigorous than any external manager would demand. The freedom to work from a beach in Bali comes with the obligation to work from the beach in Bali. This is freedom reconceptualized as intensified self-exploitation. You're not liberated from work. You're liberated into a condition where work and life become indistinguishable, where every moment becomes potentially productive, where rest itself requires justification. The digital nomad posting from Bali isn't escaping capitalism. They're its most complete expression. They've internalized the demands so thoroughly that they no longer need external discipline. They become their own manager, their own supervisor, their own metrics-obsessed efficiency expert. And when they burn out, as they inevitably do, the system has a solution ready. Better boundaries, more mindful work practices, a revised approach to time management. The problem is never the demand for constant productivity. It's always your failure to manage that demand correctly. The algorithm sells you a fantasy of autonomy while constructing conditions of total control. It removes the external boss while installing a more ruthless internal one. It promises freedom while delivering a prison you've built yourself, with walls you maintain through voluntary surveillance. You track your productivity, you monitor your output, you measure your progress, and you experience this as agency, as taking control of your life. But control for what purpose? Toward what end? The algorithm never asks these questions because the answers might reveal that your freedom is simply a more sophisticated form of bondage. They've taught you to weaponize optimism against yourself. Every setback becomes a learning opportunity. Every failure becomes feedback. Every obstacle becomes a chance to demonstrate resilience. The algorithm fills your feed with motivational content, quotes overlaid on sunsets, stories of perseverance, testimonials of triumph over adversity. The message is always the same. Your mindset determines your reality. But this logic contains a hidden cruelty. If your mindset determines your reality, then your difficult reality reveals a deficient mindset. Your struggle becomes evidence of your negativity. Your exhaustion proves your lack of gratitude. Your accurate perception of structural impossibility gets diagnosed as limiting belief. The person who cannot pay rent through positive thinking hasn't failed to manifest abundance. They've encountered an economic system that determines housing access through accumulated capital, not consciousness. The person who cannot cure their chronic illness through affirmations hasn't failed to harness the power of belief. They've encountered a body subject to biological limits that cognition cannot override. But the algorithm cannot afford these materialist readings. It must maintain the fantasy that everything is solvable through sufficient positivity, because this fantasy is infinitely monetizable. It can sell you courses on mindset, books on manifestation, coaches who promise to unlock your limiting beliefs. And when these solutions fail, as they must, the system has an explanation ready. You didn't believe hard enough. You didn't commit fully. You had resistance. The failure is always yours, never the framework's. This is how the algorithm converts structural violence into personal responsibility. It takes the damage inflicted by impossible demands and reframes it as your failure to maintain the correct attitude. It pathologizes your accurate distress and sells you the cure for a disease you don't have. You wake up tired, not the tiredness that comes from insufficient sleep, but the existential fatigue of knowing that today, like yesterday, will require a performance you're not sure you can sustain. The algorithm has taught you to interpret this fatigue as personal deficit. You need better sleep hygiene. You need supplements. You need to exercise more, meditate more, optimize more. The solution is always individual intervention. But what if your tiredness isn't a problem to solve? What if it's information? What if your body is accurately registering that what's being demanded is unsustainable? The system cannot tolerate this reading, because if your exhaustion is structural rather than personal, then the solution isn't a better morning routine. It's a different system. And that possibility threatens everything the algorithm has constructed. So you're offered endless variations of the same solution. Productivity apps that promise to organize your overwhelm. Meditation subscriptions that promise to calm your justified anxiety. Wellness programs that promise to restore energy the system is actively extracting. And beneath all these solutions runs a single message. You are the problem, and you're the project. Your depletion isn't evidence of impossible demands. It's evidence of insufficient optimization. But your body knows something your mind has been trained to deny. That tiredness you carry isn't weakness. It's resistance. It's your organism's refusal to comply with a demand that exceeds human capacity. The algorithm needs you to misread this refusal as failure. Because the moment you recognize it as accurate perception, the entire architecture becomes visible. You see that the exhaustion isn't distributed equally. That some people's ease comes at the cost of others' depletion. That the system requires your fatigue to sustain their freedom. There exists a category of experience the algorithm cannot capture. Moments that generate no data. Activities that produce no content. Time that leaves no trace. The conversation that meanders without conclusion. The afternoon spent staring at nothing in particular. The thought that arrives and departs without being documented. These are the spaces the system cannot colonize, and therefore cannot tolerate. The algorithm has taught you to experience these moments as waste, as time that could have been optimized, as potential productivity lost. Every untracked hour becomes evidence of your inefficiency. But these unmeasured moments are where actual life occurs. Not the performed life, not the curated existence, not the optimized self. The life that happens when you're not trying to happen. The experience that unfolds when you're not attempting to capture it. The algorithm cannot afford for you to discover that these moments are not only valuable, but necessary. That the human capacity for presence requires absence from surveillance. That genuine thought emerges only when you're not performing thought for an audience. So it fills every gap with content. It ensures that waiting rooms, commutes, bathroom breaks, all become opportunities for consumption. It eliminates the space between stimuli, because that space is where questioning begins. The person scrolling through their feed while eating lunch alone isn't choosing entertainment. They're fleeing a moment the algorithm has taught them to experience as unbearable, being with themselves, unobserved, unproductive, unmeasured. But that moment of solitary lunch, that instant of being nobody to nobody, is precisely what the system must eliminate. Because in that space, you might recognize something dangerous. That you exist independent of your metrics. That your value isn't determined by your output. That the exhaustion you're experiencing isn't personal failure, but accurate response to structural impossibility. Here's what the algorithm cannot tell you, what it's designed to obscure, what threatens its entire operation. You were never insufficient. The inadequacy you feel, the gap between who you are and who you should be, the sense that everyone else has figured out something you're missing. None of this is accurate perception. It's constructed perception. It's the predictable result of a system that profits from your perpetual self-improvement. The algorithm needs you to believe that you're incomplete because complete people stop consuming. Satisfied people stop searching. People who recognize their adequacy stop purchasing solutions to problems they don't have. So it shows you endless evidence of your insufficiency, not through direct criticism, which you might resist, but through the apparently neutral presentation of what others have achieved. It lets comparison do its work, knowing that comparison is the most efficient method of generating discontent. But notice what happens when you extract yourself from the comparison. When you stop measuring your reading list against someone else's. When you stop evaluating your productivity against another's output. When you stop judging your body against the curated images of bodies that may not even exist outside of editing software. In that space beyond comparison, a different recognition becomes possible. You see that your life, unmeasured, might actually be sufficient. That your pace, uncompared, might be exactly right for you. That your choices, unjudged, might reflect accurate knowledge of your actual needs rather than failure to achieve someone else's performance. This recognition is what the algorithm most fears. Because once you see through the constructed inadequacy, once you recognize that the gap you've been trying to close was manufactured, the entire system of perpetual optimization loses its power. You cannot fix this by optimizing better. That's the trap. The solution to the violence of achievement capitalism isn't to achieve more efficiently. It's to stop accepting achievement as the measure of human worth. This doesn't mean abandoning goals or effort or growth. It means recognizing that your value isn't conditional on your productivity, that your existence doesn't require justification through output, that being alive is sufficient, and everything else is addition rather than completion of some essential lack. The algorithm will call this laziness. It will diagnose your refusal to optimize as depression, as lack of ambition, as failure to reach your potential. It'll show you people who've achieved more, produced more, optimized more. It will remind you constantly that you could be doing better. But better according to whose definition? Potential according to whose measurement? Achievement according to whose values? The algorithm never asks these questions because the answers might reveal that its entire framework serves interests that aren't yours. When you stop trying to fix your supposed inadequacy, when you refuse to participate in the project of perpetual self-improvement, something unexpected happens. Not collapse, as the system warned. Not stagnation. Not the death of ambition. Instead, you discover what you actually want beneath what you've been taught to want. You find desires that belong to you rather than desires implanted by algorithmic suggestion. You encounter a version of yourself that exists independent of metrics and measurements and comparative rankings. This self isn't better or worse than the optimized version you've been constructing. It's simply more actual, more responsive to your genuine needs rather than algorithmically generated ones. More capable of distinguishing between exhaustion that comes from meaningful effort and exhaustion that comes from participating in your own exploitation. The secret the algorithms don't want you to know is absurdly simple. You're already enough. The insufficiency you feel is manufactured. The gap you're trying to close is artificial. And the moment you recognize this, their power dissolves. Not because you've beaten the algorithm at its own game, but because you've stopped playing